On the morning of 17 August 1943, high above Schweinfurt, Germany, at nearly 25,000 feet, the extreme cold fused Luftwaffe pilot Heinsko's oxygen mask to his skin. From behind the cockpit canopy, he watched a scene developing in the upper atmosphere that felt almost unreal. A sight so vast that it seemed to push the limits of what a pilot could reasonably process. Across southern Germany, men like Kanoke suddenly found themselves thrust into a situation that defied logic. Only around 40 German fighters managed to take off and climb into position in time, a scattered defensive force attempting to confront what could only be described as an airborne armada. The air was crystal clear at that altitude, making the incoming formation impossible to miss. Spread across the sky were 376 B-17 flying fortresses, divided between targets at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. From a distance, the bomber stream looked less like a formation of aircraft and more like a vast metallic front, glinting in the rising sun like a slow-moving sheet of polished silver. Each B-17 carried an array of defensive .50 caliber guns, and the bombers flew in tightly organized geometric groupings. These combat boxes overlapped their firing arcs so effectively that any fighter attempting to close in would face a dense, coordinated barrier of gunfire. The units rushing to intercept, Jagdgeschwader 11, with assistance from elements of JG-1 and JG-26, were confronted by simple arithmetic that offered no comfort. A handful of interceptors pitted against hundreds of American aircraft. Only months earlier, such figures would have been dismissed by German officers as Allied exaggeration. Yet by mid-1943, these overwhelming odds had become a daily reality for Luftwaffe pilots defending central Germany. For the men climbing to meet the incoming bombers, the event taking shape above the Reich was not just another operation. It was a tangible demonstration of the industrial weight of the United States, now being applied with increasing intensity. Between 1943 and 1944, the Luftwaffe experienced a rapid collapse in air superiority, a reversal so abrupt that many German veterans later described it as watching the air war flip completely on its axis. Only a few years earlier, during the rapid German advances in 1940, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed a sense of dominance over European skies. But by August of 1943, that confidence had evaporated. The scale and frequency of the American bombing campaigns had risen beyond anything German strategists had imagined possible. The combined Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid of August 17, designated Mission 84, marked a new step in Allied strategic planning. Under the leadership of Colonel Curtis LeMay, the 4th Bombardment Wing dispatched 146 B-17s toward the Messerschmitt production facilities in Regensburg, while the 1st Bombardment Wing sent another 230 bombers to attack the vital ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. The reasoning behind these targets was carefully calculated. Ball bearings represented a critical vulnerability in German industry. Nearly every major weapon system required them, and shortages would ripple through the entire war economy. At the same time, the Regensburg plant was responsible for producing roughly 1/3 of Germany's single-engine fighter output. Removing both capabilities simultaneously would cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to rebuild its strength. Recognizing the danger, German fighter commander Adolf Galland ordered every combat-ready aircraft into the air. Units from JG-1 lifted off from Damm and Schiphol, JG-11 scrambled from Jever and Oldenburg, and JG-26 launched from bases such as Lidl and Wevelgem. Despite these efforts, the Luftwaffe faced an attacker whose sheer industrial capacity threatened to overwhelm Germany's defensive network. The events of that day would become one of the clearest demonstrations of the widening gap between American production power and Germany's diminishing ability to counter it in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe's elite fighter wings, units once celebrated for their mastery of the air over France, Britain, and the Eastern Front, entered a period in which their experience offered diminishing returns. Even pilots decorated with the Knight's Cross and oak leaves found that the sheer scale of the American daylight bombing offensive threatened to overwhelm any individual skill. In response, German commanders began experimenting with increasingly unorthodox tactics in hopes of breaking apart the dense bomber formations. One of the most unusual methods came from pilot Hans-Joachim Hayo Hermann, who helped develop an attack in which fighters released bombs downward into the compact clusters of U.S. heavy bombers. On 22 March 1943, Hermann succeeded in destroying a B-17 using this vertical bombing maneuver, an unprecedented feat, marking the first time a pilot had downed an enemy aircraft with an aerially dropped bomb. He later recounted these risky trials in his memoir, I Flew for the Führer, describing how much guesswork, improvisation, and determination were required to overcome the defensive fire of the American formations. Yet despite such creativity, these efforts amounted to little more than isolated successes against a force that continued to expand at a relentless pace. By the time of the second raid on Schweinfurt, 14th October 1943, a day remembered as Black Thursday, the challenge confronting the Luftwaffe had intensified dramatically. That morning, 291 B-17s pushed deep into German airspace. In response, the Luftwaffe mounted one of its last large-scale coordinated defenses, scrambling more than 300 fighters from 24 airfields. Major Heinz Bear's 2/JG-1 took off in Focke-Wulf FW-190s equipped with WGR-21 rockets, while JG-11 launched similarly armed aircraft distinguished by their yellow Reich defense bands, in contrast to the red markings carried by JG-1. For a moment, the Germans appeared to achieve a significant triumph. 60 U.S. bombers were destroyed, a staggering loss rate of just over 20%, severe enough that American commanders temporarily halted deep penetration missions. But the Luftwaffe's apparent victory concealed a devastating reality. Between 35 and 38 German fighters were shot down, and many of the casualties were highly seasoned pilots whose experience could not be replaced. Among the dead was Oberleutnant Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz Gallant, younger brother of the famed Adolf Gallant, killed when defensive fire brought down his FW-190. For the Luftwaffe, each fallen veteran represents the years of training and combat knowledge that Germany no longer had the capacity to replenish. The American bombers themselves were formidable defensive platforms. A single B-17G bristled with guns positioned to cover nearly every approach, and when arranged in the combat box formation, typically 18 to 21 aircraft supporting each other, the collective firepower created a deadly barrier that made direct head-on assaults nearly suicidal and flank attacks perilous. German fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109G6 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A4 were exceptional machines in one-on-one combat, but by late 1943, simply reaching the bomber streams had become a major challenge. The introduction of the P-47 Thunderbolt fitted with drop tanks extended the range of American escorts deep into the Reich, and by early 1944, these escorts routinely intercepted German aircraft before they could mount coordinated attacks. When the P-51 Mustang finally appeared over Berlin in March 1944, the Luftwaffe found itself confronting an enemy that could now escort bombers all the way to the heart of the German capital and back. Faced with this new reality, German units began devising increasingly desperate and sometimes ingenious solutions, ranging from heavy rocket attacks to specialized interception groups. But each new measure only underscored the same strategic truth. The Luftwaffe was struggling to survive long enough even to reach the bombers, let alone break their formations. The concept behind the Sturmgruppen was brutal in its simplicity. Heavily reinforced FW-190s were tasked with driving straight into American bomber formations, withholding fire until they were almost touching their targets. Their 30mm cannons were intended to obliterate a bomber with a single close-range burst. Once their ammunition ran dry, many pilots were instructed, explicitly or implicitly, to ram the enemy if the situation demanded it. These Sturmrücker assaults pushed the limits of human nerve. The aircraft, fitted with additional armor plating, often bored through dense bomber boxes, sometimes slicing into wings or tail sections with their own propellers, in a desperate attempt to break the formation. The broader fate of Germany's premier fighter units mirrored the collapse of the Luftwaffe itself. Jagdgeschwader 1, later named Ossau in honor of Walter Ossau, killed on 11 May 1944, became a stark illustration of this decline. Ossau, credited with 127 victories and considered one of Germany's most formidable aces, was shot down by P-38 Lightnings. His death was emblematic. Even the most seasoned pilots could no longer survive the escalating air battles. JG-1's situation deteriorated rapidly. Between the death of Major Hans Philipp on 8 October 1943, after achieving a remarkable 206 victories, and Ossau's loss 7 months later, the unit cycled through commanding officers at a pace that made stable leadership nearly impossible. Despite claiming more than 700 enemy aircraft over the course of the war, JG-1 suffered devastating human costs. 464 killed in action, 174 wounded, and 94 lost in accidents, numbers that exceeded its official strength. Another elite group, Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageder, under the command of Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, was responsible for defending the Channel Front during the crucial months surrounding D-Day. Although individual engagements sometimes produced impressive kill ratios, the overall toll was ruinous. Out of 754 pilots who cycled through JG-26 during the war, 584 were killed or wounded, a staggering casualty rate of 77%. By the end of 1943, only 107 of the 185 assigned pilots were still fit to fly. The erosion of the Luftwaffe's training system proved even more disastrous than combat attrition. Before the war, German pilot instruction was considered among the best in the world, requiring more than 250 hours of flight training with extensive practice in aerobatics, formation flying, and aerial gunnery. By 1944, the program had disintegrated. Training hours fell to roughly 112 hours, and many trainees failed to complete even that reduced curriculum due to severe fuel shortages. By contrast, American pilots arrived in Europe with over 300 hours of flight time and a fully developed skill set. The Luftwaffe's new pilots, in many cases, arrived at combat units barely capable of handling their aircraft. Johannes Steinhoff, one of Germany's most accomplished aces with 176 victories, later wrote about the grim reality they faced. According to him, replacements often arrived with scarcely 100 hours in the air, including perhaps 10 hours on the Bf-109. Units were expected to turn these young men into combat-ready pilots in just 2 weeks, yet many were killed within their first handful of missions. Statistics reveal how fast the system was collapsing. In the first half of 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 1,100 fighter pilots, 60% of its strength at the beginning of that year. By 1944, monthly losses approached 25%, meaning entire units were essentially replaced every 4 months. Only commanding officers tended to have substantial combat experience. The majority of pilots entering battle had been active for less than a month before becoming casualties. The Allied strategic bombing campaign targeting Germany's fuel production finally pushed the Luftwaffe past the point of recovery. Synthetic fuel plants, responsible for around 92% of Germany's aviation gasoline and producing roughly 124,000 barrels per day in early 1944, were systematically attacked beginning in May of that year. Once these facilities were crippled, even well-trained pilots could no longer operate effectively, and by then, Germany had few such pilots left. On May 12, 1944, a massive Allied air operation unfolded when nearly 1,000 heavy bombers targeted Germany's synthetic fuel industry. The blow was immediate and devastating. Facilities that had produced roughly 175,000 tons of fuel in April saw their output collapse to only 52,000 tons by June. July brought another steep drop to about 35,000 tons, and by early autumn, production had dwindled to a mere trickle, around 5,000 tons in September. By midsummer, Albert Speer reported that almost the entire Axis fuel manufacturing network, an estimated 98%, had been knocked offline. The situation carried a grim irony. Even as the fuel system disintegrated, German aircraft factories were achieving record-breaking output. In 1944 alone, they rolled out close to 40,000 aircraft, nearly 25,000 of them fighters. Fighter production reached its highest monthly figure that September, surpassing 3,000 machines. But these aircraft were largely useless. Without fuel and without fully trained pilots, they sat lined up on airfields, unable to take to the sky. To conserve what little aviation fuel remained, Luftwaffe ground crews resorted to moving aircraft with teams of oxen. By November 1944, pilot training flights had been halted altogether, and frontline squadrons were rationed to roughly 1/10 of the minimum fuel they required. In many units, aviators were permitted only a single brief training sortie each month. By February 1945, synthetic fuel production had essentially collapsed, amounting to just half of 1% of what it had been at the start of 1944. Long before the Luftwaffe was destroyed in combat, its pilots suffered a profound psychological decline. Men who had entered the war with confidence and a sense of mastery gradually became marked by resignation and fatalism. Johannes Steinhoff later wrote in his memoir that the identity of the fighter arm had inverted over the years. In 1940, they had been hunters. By 1943, they had become prey. And by 1944, they felt like stationary targets awaiting destruction. His reflections describe the slow, painful recognition among fighter groups that the war could no longer be won and that the senior leadership had abandoned any pretense of rational decision-making.
This growing disillusionment reached its climax on January 22, 1945, in what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. Germany's most accomplished aces, Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Gunther Lutzow, and Hannes Trotloff, met with Hermann Göring at the Haus der Flieger in Berlin. Their confrontation amounted to an unprecedented rebellion within the Luftwaffe's elite. The pilots presented a series of direct accusations, unrealistic expectations, charges of cowardice leveled at units fighting hopeless battles, poor strategic direction, and the dismissal of Galland from his position as Journal der Jagdflieger. Steinhoff argued to Göring that the Me-262 jet fighters should be committed immediately to a dedicated defensive role where their speed could inflict substantial losses on American bomber formations. Göring's reaction showed just how far removed he had become from the reality of the air war. He denounced the officers as disloyal and even hinted that their actions bordered on treason. At one point, when presented with wreckage of downed P-51 Mustangs, he refused to believe they had been shot down over Germany at all, claiming instead that such aircraft must have simply glided into the country after falling elsewhere. Although the rebellious pilots were not executed, they were far from celebrated. Göring scattered them across various posts, stripping them of influence. Lutzow was effectively exiled to Italy. Steinhoff was barred from stepping onto any Luftwaffe base, and Trotloff was dismissed from his command altogether. The decisive turning point arrived with Operation Argument, later remembered as Big Week. Between 20 and 25 February 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched more than 3,000 bombing sorties. The 15th Air Force added another 500, and night raids by the RAF completed the assault. In total, Roughly 10,000 tons of bombs rained down on Germany's aircraft production network. The first day set the tone. On February 20, about 1,030 American bombers, guarded by 835 escort fighters, descended on numerous industrial targets. The Luftwaffe, severely strained by losses and fuel shortages, managed to put up only scattered opposition, perhaps 150 fighters in all. Hannes Kanecki, then serving as Staffelkapitän 5 by JG-11, left a stark account of the Luftwaffe's condition. His unit launched with 8 fighters. 2 turned back almost immediately due to mechanical failures. Only 6 reached the engagement zone, and merely 2 made it home. He wrote that the sky seemed saturated with Mustangs, an image that captured the hopeless imbalance. By the end of the week, the Luftwaffe had lost 262 fighters and about 100 veteran pilots, including decorated ace Hermann Kurt Euben, who had earned the Knight's Cross and achieved 110 aerial victories.
American losses, 226 bombers and 28 fighters, were heavy but easily replaced, highlighting the immense industrial contrast. The week conclusively demonstrated that U.S. escort fighters had gained dominance over German airspace. A symbolic collapse followed on 6 March 1944. That day, 730 B-17s and B-24s struck Berlin in broad daylight, protected by 800 fighters, among them the increasingly feared P-51 Mustangs. For German airmen, the sight of American fighters roaming above the Reich's capital erased any lingering belief that the situation was recoverable. The Luftwaffe managed only 83 sorties, far too few to meaningfully influence the outcome. Losses were one-sided, and the bombing left Berlin burning while German pilots could do little but watch. Adolf Galland later reflected, "March 6, 1944 was the moment I became certain the war was lost, not because Berlin had been bombed before, but because the Americans could do it in daylight and lose scarcely 5%, while we sacrificed 30%. Memoirs from Germany's surviving aces chronicle this descent, from early war mastery of the skies to near-total destruction. These pilots, once regarded as the elite of the Luftwaffe, found themselves buried beneath the overwhelming material capacity of the Allies. Galland wrote in The First and the Last that a fighter pilot's nature is tied to freedom of action, to hunt, pursue, and strike. Remove that initiative, he argued, and the very essence of the fighter pilot disappears. His aggression, his satisfaction in battle, and the instincts that made him effective. Johannes Steinhoff, who completed 993 combat missions, described a leadership that by this stage had abandoned any sense of rational decision-making, both toward its own servicemen and the opposing forces. Fighter units, he wrote, had been trapped in the midst of political delusion and military collapse. The shift in Heinz Kanecki's perspective was particularly vivid. Early in the conflict, he had expressed excitement. The idea of taking part in a real war appeals to me. But by 1944, his outlook had flipped entirely. His later entries emphasized the futility of attempting resistance against an enemy that possessed not only greater numbers, but also increasing technical superiority. For pilots like him, continuing the fight had become an exercise in inevitability rather than purpose. Major Heinz Baer, who ended the conflict with 221 confirmed aerial victories, once summarized the changing balance of air power with stark clarity. According to him, the Luftwaffe began the war in 1940 commanding the skies with near-total confidence. By the following year, that dominance had eroded into an uneasy rivalry with the Royal Air Force. As the war dragged into 1943, American air forces entered the scene in strength, turning the air war into a desperate contest. By 1944, German pilots were no longer fighting for advantage. They were simply trying to stay alive. Among the machines that symbolized both German innovation and German strategic failure was the Messerschmitt 262. It was the world's first jet fighter to enter operational service, capable of reaching roughly 540 miles per hour, a speed advantage of about 100 miles per hour over the fastest Allied piston-engined fighters. On paper, the aircraft should have altered the direction of the air war. Roughly 1,430 Messerschmitt 262s were ultimately manufactured, yet the impact they could have had was blunted before they even reached the front. Adolf Hitler insisted for months that the aircraft be configured as a fighter bomber, not as an interceptor, delaying deployment as a pure fighter until late 1944. When Adolf Galland demonstrated the Messerschmitt 262, he later described the jet's acceleration as if angels were pushing the aircraft forward, a sensation Hitler virtually ignored, asking instead about how many bombs it could carry. Even once the aircraft was belatedly cleared to operate as a fighter, the Luftwaffe was in no position to exploit its revolutionary capabilities. Fuel shortages, a shrinking training pipeline, and the deteriorating state of the German logistical system meant that units such as Jagdgeschwader 7, the first jet wing, could rarely field more than 30 serviceable Me-262s at the same time. Against Allied bomber streams numbering into the thousands, even a breakthrough technology was powerless. The crisis came sharply into focus on June 6, 1944. After years of anticipating an Allied landing in Western Europe, the Luftwaffe formations assigned to defend the French coast were all but spent. Luftwaffe 3, responsible for the region, could muster only around 100 operational fighters. In contrast, the Allies unleashed 11,590 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe responded with 319 sorties in total, a mere 35 of them flown by fighters.
One of the few actions that day entered legend precisely because it achieved nothing. Due to a mistimed relocation of Jagdgeschwader 26, almost the entire wing was absent from its airfields. Only Josef Priller and his wingman Heinsko, flying from Lille, were available to oppose the landings. Priller later recounted being ordered to attack the invasion beaches with just their 2 fighters, a command he could only describe as madness. They carried out a single strafing run over Sword Beach before disengaging, a symbolic gesture that effectively represented the entirety of the Luftwaffe's daylight resistance to the largest amphibious assault in history. The attrition behind this collapse was unprecedented. Across the war, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 26,800 fighter pilots killed or missing. By 1944, monthly pilot losses reached levels no Air Force could endure. January 1944, 16.9% of fighter pilots lost. February, 18.2%. March, 21.7%. April, 19.8%. May, 24.3%. June, 25.8%. Losses of this magnitude meant the fighter arm was effectively replaced every few months. Training schools could not keep pace. One class from Jagdfliegerschule 5, graduating in December 1943, suffered 80% casualties within just 3 months of entering combat. Frontline squadrons bled pilots at similar rates. Between January and June 1944, JG-26 recorded 58 pilots killed. JG-2 Richthofen lost 67. JG-11 suffered 73 fatalities. When Priller assumed command of JG-26 in early 1943, the unit included 23 pilots who'd flown more than 100 missions. By June 1944, only 3 such veterans remained. Compounding all of this was a fatal miscalculation at the intelligence level. German analysts estimated that American aircraft production in 1942 would be approximately 18,000 aircraft. The real figure was nearly 48,000, a staggering gap that illustrated just how severely the Luftwaffe had underestimated the industrial might of the United States.
In 1943, German planners assumed that the United States would struggle to turn out more than 30,000 aircraft. Reality shattered that expectation. American factories delivered 85,898 that year. By the following year, the German High Command raised its projection to around 50,000, but even that larger estimate proved far too modest. The actual American total for 1944 climbed to 96,318 machines, a figure so immense that it surpassed anything German analysts considered plausible. When reports reached Hermann Göring claiming that U.S. fighter production alone had reached 3,000 units per month, he dismissed the documents outright. Convinced they were Allied fabrications, he ordered them destroyed. Yet the truth surpassed even those figures. Monthly output of American fighters exceeded 3,600, demonstrating an industrial momentum the Luftwaffe could no longer hope to match. Single aircraft programs revealed the scale of this imbalance. The B-17 program produced 12,731 bombers by war's end, with Boeing's facility in Seattle achieving a peak rate of 16 aircraft per day. Ford's Willow Run plant, an emblem of American assembly line efficiency, completed one B-24 every 63 minutes, transforming heavy bombers into what seemed like mass-produced commodities. Germany, despite the organizational changes introduced by Albert Speer, never reached comparable levels. German aircraft production peaked in 1944 at roughly 39,000 units. Even this record output offered little practical relief, as the Luftwaffe lacked both the fuel reserves and the trained personnel required to operate the machines. In the same year, the United States alone manufactured nearly 96,318 aircraft. When British and Soviet production numbers are added, the Axis faced an industrial ratio of roughly 4-to-1, an imbalance too vast for any tactical ingenuity or bravery to overcome. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe had deteriorated into a force that existed more on paper than in the sky. Although more than 1,000 fighters were nominally available, perhaps 100 were actually capable of flying on any given day. Fuel stocks were so depleted that pilots were often limited to a single sortie per week. Many airmen entered combat with fewer than 50 hours of flight time, a fraction of what their predecessors had possessed earlier in the war. On 18 March 1945, pilot Heinsko flew what would be his final mission. His diary entries from that period portray the dying days of the Luftwaffe with stark clarity. Aircraft patched together and barely airworthy, crews operating on the edge of exhaustion, fuel tanks nearly dry, and an overwhelming sense that defeat was no longer avoidable. The numerical trends visible since 1943 had finally run their course.
By the end of the war, the Luftwaffe had lost an estimated 76,875 aircraft, including about 43,000 destroyed in direct combat. Human losses were similarly devastating. 165,000 aircrew killed, 155,000 wounded, and roughly 192,000 listed as missing or captured. In contrast, the U.S. 8th Air Force, though it suffered grievous casualties, 26,000 dead out of more than 350,000 personnel, was supported by an industrial base capable of replacing both aircraft and crews at a pace Germany could never approach. In 1944 alone, the Allied nations produced approximately 163,099 aircraft, compared to Germany's roughly 39,000. In the face of such overwhelming output, even the most determined pilots could not alter the final outcome. The war in the air had become a contest of industry, and Germany's industrial capacity had simply been outmatched beyond recovery. The collapse of the Luftwaffe offers a long-lasting case study in the nature of industrialized conflict. Germany's fighter corps, which entered the war with arguably the most seasoned and rigorously trained aviators on Earth, was not defeated because its pilots lacked resolve. Their downfall emerged from a force far colder and more decisive, the arithmetic of mass production. The United States adopted a model built on volume and sustainability rather than elite specialization. It emphasized the ability to train large numbers of good, if not extraordinary, airmen,
to build machines in staggering quantities, and to continue operating despite heavy losses. Against the system, Germany's reliance on exceptional individual skill became a fatal weakness. Its celebrated aces racked up impressive personal records, yet their achievements could not shift outcomes that were being set day by day inside American factories. By the time German units confronted the enormous American bomber streams, often with only small formations of interceptors, they were staring directly at the essence of industrial warfare. No amount of tactical brilliance could compensate for such imbalance. Once the production gap grew wide enough, the trajectory of the air war became a numbers problem with a predetermined answer. For the fighter pilots of 1943 and 1944, the experience was unlike anything airmen had encountered before. Veterans later recalled skies crowded with shining bomber groups stretching far beyond the horizon, a mechanical flood that signaled not only tactical defeat, but a much deeper shift in what air power meant. What began early in the war as a contest between hunter and prey had been reversed with shocking speed. In 1940, German fighters roamed across Europe almost unchallenged. 4 years later, they struggled merely to protect their own bases, often being attacked before they could even climb to altitude.
This was not a slow erosion. It was a rapid and overwhelming disintegration. The so-called fighter pilots' revolt in January 1945 was the final moment of clarity. Germany's most accomplished aviators openly confronted Göring, acknowledging what had long been obvious. The war in the air was beyond saving, and every further mission would only add to the ledger of needless losses. Their protest put into words what the rank and file had understood for months. The pilots who continued flying in the final year of the conflict did so with the heavy knowledge that victory was impossible. Many launched into the air because duty compelled them, or because combat flying was the only life they had ever known. Their courage was undeniable, yet the war around them had shifted into a form where bravery had almost no influence on outcome. What they witnessed was the conversion of air combat into a mechanized calculation. The vast bomber armadas were more than military formations. They were symbols of industrial capacity on a scale Germany could not match. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not merely a battlefield event. It marked the end of an era when individual mastery could dominate the sky. By 1945, the lesson was unmistakable. Once the balance of machines, manpower, and production tipped far enough, the role of the lone fighter ace became insignificant. The German pilots of the late war learned, often at the cost of their lives, that modern conflict favors systems over heroes. The age in which a single pilot could shape the course of a campaign had closed. A new age, defined by factories, logistics, and output measured in thousands, had taken its place.